Ethan Grayson had always felt more at home in the wilderness than among bustling city streets. At 28, when he received his acceptance letter to work as a park ranger at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, it felt like destiny. The job promised tranquility and purpose. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the dark truths lurking in the park's depths. Ethan's first day began like a dream. The sun rose over an ocean of green peaks, casting long shadows through the valleys. The ranger station, a small wooden cabin nestled between towering trees, seemed quaint and inviting. Ethan met the team. Mark, the grizzled veteran with a rough voice and laughter lines carved deep into his face. Sarah, a bright-eyed ecologist who radiated enthusiasm for the park's biodiversity, and a few others, each with their own stories and connection to the wilderness. They welcomed him warmly, sharing advice and anecdotes about the Smokies. As the day turned into evening, Ethan decided to walk a nearby trail to familiarize himself with the terrain. The towering trees cast long shadows under the fading sunlight. The stillness was soothing at first, but soon it felt oppressive, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. That's when he saw it, a deer, standing motionless between the trees. Its large, dark eyes seemed too aware, too knowing. When it made a sound, Ethan's stomach dropped. It wasn't a grunt or a snort, but a whisper. The words were garbled, human-like, but unintelligible. Ethan froze. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the forest, until it stopped abruptly. He blinked, and the deer was gone. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the scene, searching for logical explanations. Exhaustion, maybe? A trick of the light? But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, Ethan noticed more peculiarities. The radios in the ranger station would occasionally crackle with faint, distorted voices, speaking in tones that sent chills down his spine. Trails that were supposed to be familiar seemed to shift subtly, their paths altered as if the forest itself were playing tricks. Mark was the first to address Ethan's growing unease. "The Smokies aren't just a park," he said one evening over a shared cup of coffee. "They're alive. We've all seen things out here that can't be explained." Mark told him stories of hikers who'd vanished for days, only to reappear miles from their last known location, with no memory of what had happened. "Some of them hear voices," he added, his voice low, "voices calling them deeper into the woods." Despite the warnings, Ethan couldn't resist the pull of the trail where he'd seen the deer. Late one night, armed with a flashlight and his growing resolve, he returned. The air was cold and still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching. As Ethan ventured deeper, the whispers began again, faint and teasing. The beam of his flashlight caught movement in the corner of his eye. He turned and saw it, the deer. But this time, its form was wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting the beam of his flashlight, and it opened its mouth. A scream erupted, a guttural, inhuman sound that sent Ethan stumbling backward. The deer's body twisted unnaturally as it stepped closer, its movements jerky and alien. The whispers swelled around him, drowning out his frantic breaths. Ethan turned and ran, the forest seeming to close in around him, branches clawing at his jacket and face. When he finally burst into the clearing near the ranger station, his knees gave out. He gasped for air, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier, as if the forest were satisfied with what it had shown him. The following day, Ethan shared his encounter with the team. To his surprise, they didn't dismiss him. Sarah's usual brightness was replaced by a grim seriousness. "You've seen it," she said softly. "The mimic." "The what?" Ethan asked, his voice still shaky. Sarah explained. "There's a legend about a creature in the Smokies. It imitates voices, sounds, even forms. It lures people deeper into the woods, and they're never the same when they come back. Some don't come back at all." Mark chimed in. "The thing is, it doesn't just mimic. It's like it's testing you, trying to see what you'll do. But why? Nobody knows." Over the next few days, Ethan's unease grew. The mimic's presence seemed to follow him, its whispers threading through his thoughts even when he was surrounded by his colleagues. One night he woke to find his cabin door ajar, the air inside heavy with the scent of damp earth. On the floor, scratched into the wood, was a symbol he didn't recognize, a twisted shape that made his head ache to look at it. Determined to confront the mimic, Ethan prepared himself for another journey into the woods. Armed with a map, a compass, and a radio, he set out at dawn. The forest seemed to hum with anticipation, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Hours into his trek, Ethan found himself at the edge of a clearing he hadn't seen before. In the center stood a massive tree, its bark etched with symbols similar to the one in his cabin. The air around the tree vibrated with a low, almost imperceptible hum. As he approached, the whispers began again, louder this time. He turned, and there it was, the mimic. Its form shifted as it moved, the outline of the deer bleeding into something larger, darker. Faces seemed to emerge from its surface, mouths open in silent screams. The whispers became words, echoing Ethan's own thoughts back at him. "Why are you here? What do you seek?" Ethan's fear gave way to a strange calm. "I seek answers," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the terror gripping him. The mimic paused, its shifting form stilling for a moment. The symbols on the tree began to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers. The mimic's form dissolved into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone in the clearing. The forest seemed to exhale, its tension easing. Though Ethan didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain. The Smokies were alive, and they were watching. Ethan returned to the station, his perspective forever altered. The mimic hadn't just been a threat, it had been a test. And while he'd survived, he knew the forest's mysteries were far from fully uncovered. The Smokies held secrets older than time, and Ethan was only beginning to understand them. Chloe Armitage had always been drawn to the isolation of the wilderness. At 34, she relished her role as a park ranger in the remote confines of Ashenwood Forest, a place veiled in dense mist and perpetual quiet. The forest was older than memory, its towering trees seemingly holding secrets of a time long forgotten. For Chloe, Ashenwood was a sanctuary, until the day she found the cabin. It was a frigid morning, and frost clung to the underbrush as she patrolled a seldom-used trail. Chloe's breath hung in the air as she rounded a bend and froze. There it was, standing in stark defiance of its surroundings. A cabin, decrepit and half-consumed by creeping ivy. It shouldn't have been there. She'd walked this trail dozens of times, yet she'd never seen it before. The cabin's wooden walls were darkened by time, and its windows were covered in grime. Something about it was wrong, a jarring discord in the harmony of the forest. The air seemed heavier here, charged with an energy that prickled against Chloe's skin. Against her better judgment, she approached. The door creaked open under her touch, revealing an interior cloaked in shadow. Dust floated in the beams of light that seeped through cracks in the walls. Symbols covered every surface, etched into the wooden walls, carved into the table, even scratched into the floorboards. They were jagged, overlapping lines that seemed alive, shifting when Chloe looked at them too long. She shuddered and backed away, nearly tripping over a pile of dried leaves that had somehow gathered inside. As Chloe turned to leave, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Spinning around, she came face to face with a figure standing just beyond the cabin's doorway. It was an old man, his wiry frame draped in tattered clothing. His face was gaunt, his eyes sharp and piercing beneath a tangle of white hair. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice carrying an unsettling weight. Chloe's hand instinctively went to her radio. "I didn't mean to intrude. This is park property. Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "Ezra," he said simply. "This place isn't for you." Something in his tone stopped her from pressing further. The way he spoke wasn't threatening, but it carried a finality that unnerved her. Chloe nodded, retreating from the cabin and its enigmatic occupant. She told herself she'd report it back at the station, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't. Something about the encounter felt personal. The days that followed were marked by a series of strange events. Animals began behaving erratically, birds circling in patterns that defied nature, deer standing motionless for hours, their eyes locked on her as she patrolled. The forest itself seemed to shift. Trails she'd known for years twisted into unfamiliar paths. And then there were the whispers, soft and indistinct, drifting through the trees at night. They sounded almost like her name. Chloe couldn't shake the cabin from her mind. She found herself drawn back to it, despite the knot of dread that tightened in her stomach with every step. Each time she approached, Ezra was there, either sitting on the rotting porch or tending to the tangled brush around the cabin. He always greeted her with the same faint smile, as if he'd been expecting her. "What are those symbols?" she asked one day, unable to contain her curiosity. Ezra looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "The forest speaks in ways most can't understand," he said. "These symbols, they're its language." Chloe frowned. "What does it say?" "That depends on who's listening," Ezra replied cryptically, before retreating into the cabin and closing the door. One evening, as twilight bled into darkness, Chloe awoke to a sharp knock at her cabin door. Heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open. No one was there, but something was waiting, a single symbol etched into the wood of her porch. It was one of the markings she'd seen at Ezra's cabin, but larger and more intricate. The sight of it made her head throb. That night, Chloe dreamed of the forest. She was walking a narrow trail she didn't recognize, the trees pressing in on either side. A low hum resonated through the air, and the symbols burned bright on the bark of every tree she passed. Ahead of her, Ezra stood at the edge of a vast clearing, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "The forest chooses," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And it has chosen you." Chloe jolted awake, drenched in sweat. She felt the pull stronger than ever now, a magnetic force dragging her back to the cabin. She needed answers, no matter the cost. The forest was unnervingly quiet as Chloe approached the cabin the next day. Ezra was waiting for her, standing beneath a gnarled tree whose bark was covered in the strange symbols. His expression was grave. "It's time," he said. "Time for what?" Chloe demanded, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "For you to understand." Ezra gestured for her to follow him. He led her deep into the forest, to a place she'd never seen before. The air grew colder with every step, the trees taller and more menacing. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols. "This is the heart of Ashenwood," Ezra said. "The forest doesn't just live, it hungers. Every generation it chooses someone to serve as its keeper, to maintain the balance between its life and the world beyond. Without a keeper, it withers. And when it withers, it fights back." Chloe stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. "And what happens to the keeper?" Ezra's expression darkened. "They are bound to the forest. Forever." "No," Chloe whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't agree to this." "The forest doesn't ask," Ezra said softly. "It chooses." Before Chloe could react, the ground beneath her began to tremble. The symbols on the altar glowed with an otherworldly light. The trees around the clearing seemed to close in, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. Ezra stepped back, his face a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "I'm sorry, Chloe, but it's your turn." The light from the altar engulfed her, and the world went dark. When Chloe awoke, she was alone in the clearing. The altar was cold and silent, the symbols no longer glowing, but she felt different. The forest's whispers were clearer now, no longer indistinct. She could hear its voice, feel its pulse. She was a part of it, and it was a part of her. Ashenwood had claimed its keeper. Liam Everett had always prided himself on his logical approach to life. At 45, with 2 decades of experience as a ranger at Wraithmore National Forest, he thought he'd seen it all: lost hikers, wildlife encounters, even the occasional eerie campfire tale spun by visitors. But nothing had prepared him for the events of that year. It began in late autumn, when the forest was at its most hauntingly beautiful. The vibrant reds and golds of the leaves were fading into stark browns, and the mist clung low to the ground like a living thing. Liam was in the station's cramped office when the call came in. A hiker had gone missing, a teenage girl named Emily. Her parents had last seen her near Shadow Creek Trail. Liam didn't waste a moment. He grabbed his gear and headed out, meeting his colleague Claire at the trailhead. Claire's youthful energy and keen instincts made her an invaluable partner, but even she seemed uneasy that day. The air was too still, the forest unnaturally silent. "Something feels off," Claire murmured as they trudged along the trail. Liam nodded but said nothing. He'd learned long ago to trust his gut, and his gut was screaming. Hours passed as they searched, their voices echoing through the empty woods. Just as dusk began to fall, they found Emily's backpack propped neatly against a tree. Nearby, the ground was disturbed, as though she'd been dragged into the undergrowth, but there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, just the stillness, heavy and oppressive. "She wouldn't have left this behind," Claire said, her voice trembling. Liam bent to examine the ground more closely. That's when he saw it. A set of symbols carved into the bark of a nearby tree. They were intricate and alien, twisting in ways that made his eyes ache. The air around them seemed colder, sharper, as though the forest itself was watching. "We need to move," Liam said, his voice firm. But as they turned back toward the trail, it was gone. The path they'd been walking for hours had vanished, replaced by dense, unyielding thickets of trees. Night fell quickly in Wraithmore, and with it came a suffocating darkness. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the gloom, illuminating gnarled roots and skeletal branches that seemed to stretch toward them. Liam tried the radio, but it was useless, emitting only static. "Stay close," he told Claire. "Do you think it's one of those stories?" she asked hesitantly. Over the years, Wraithmoor had garnered a reputation for strange disappearances. Locals whispered about the vanishing path, a phenomenon where trails would shift and lead hikers into a realm they were never meant to see. Liam had always dismissed such tales as folklore. Now, he wasn't so sure. As they pressed on, the forest seemed to change around them. The trees grew larger, their bark darker, almost charred. Strange sounds filled the air, low whispers, indistinct and unnerving. Liam's flashlight flickered, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure standing among the trees. When he turned the beam back, it was gone. "Did you see that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep moving," Liam said, though his own fear was mounting. The whispers grew louder, forming words that neither of them could fully understand. The symbols began to appear more frequently, etched into trees and stones. Liam felt as though they were being guided, herded towards something. Finally, they emerged into a clearing. At its center stood a massive tree, its roots sprawling like a spider's web. The symbols covered its bark, glowing faintly in the darkness. Beneath the tree, Emily sat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide but unseeing. Claire rushed forward, but Liam grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said. The air around the tree was wrong, heavy and charged, as though it were alive. Emily slowly turned her head toward them, her movements jerky, puppet-like. When she spoke, her voice was layered, as though a dozen others were speaking through her. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her mouth moved, but the voice wasn't hers. "Emily," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're here to take you home." Emily laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "There is no home, only the forest." Liam stepped forward cautiously. "What do you want?" he demanded. The girl's head tilted further, her neck creaking audibly. "The balance must be kept," she said. "One must stay." Liam's heart sank. He'd heard the stories. The forest demanded a keeper, someone to maintain its ancient, unknowable equilibrium. Those who were chosen were never truly seen again, their existence fading like a forgotten dream. "No," Claire said firmly. "We're not leaving her here." Emily's eyes flickered with something almost human, a fleeting moment of recognition. Then she screamed. The sound was inhuman, reverberating through the clearing and sending waves of pain through Liam's skull. The tree's roots began to writhe, curling toward them like serpents. Liam grabbed Claire and pulled her back. "Run!" he shouted. They sprinted into the forest, the whispers now a deafening roar. The symbols on the trees glowed brighter, lighting their way but also disorienting them. Liam could feel the forest shifting, its very fabric warping to trap them. Just when it seemed they would be swallowed by the darkness, they burst through the tree line and onto the trailhead. The air was suddenly lighter, the whispers gone. Behind them, the forest stood silent, as though it had never moved at all. Emily's body was never recovered. Search teams combed the area for weeks but found no trace of her or the strange clearing. Lima and Claire reported what they'd seen, but their story was met with skepticism. The official record listed Emily as a missing person, lost to the wilderness. But Lima knew the truth. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes or the sound of her voice. The forest had taken her, and it had let him go, for now. But he could still feel its presence, a faint hum at the edge of his consciousness, a reminder that it was always watching. Lima continued his work at Wraithmoor, though he never ventured near Shadow Creek Trail again. The symbols haunted his dreams, their meaning just out of reach. He began keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence, every fleeting glimpse of the unnatural. He hoped that one day he might understand. But deep down he knew some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. The vanishing path wasn't just a legend, it was a doorway, and Lima had come too close to stepping through. The Hollywood National Preserve was a place of beauty and shadows. Known for its dense canopy and hidden glades, it was a favorite for hikers seeking solace. For Jacob Marlowe, a 38-year-old park ranger, it was home. He'd spent years maintaining its trails, educating visitors and safeguarding its wildlife. But in the fall of 2025, Jacob discovered that Hollywood held secrets far darker than its shaded paths. It began with a report of strange sounds near Black Hollow Trail. Visitors claimed to hear voices, urgent whispers that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. At first, Jacob chalked it up to overactive imaginations, but as the reports grew more frequent and more unnerving, he decided to investigate. On a crisp October morning, Jacob set out alone, The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the forest was eerily silent. Black Hollow Trail was a narrow, winding path that cut through the oldest part of the preserve. The trees here were massive, their twisted roots forming natural barriers. As Jacob walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. An hour into his trek, the whispers began. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible. Jacob paused, listening. The voices seemed to surround him, echoing from every direction. He called out, thinking it might be hikers, but no one answered. Instead, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Turn back," they seemed to say. "Leave this place." Jacob's heart pounded, but he pressed on. He told himself it was just the wind or the rustling of leaves. Yet the voices followed him, growing sharper with every step. The trail ended in a small clearing, dominated by an ancient oak tree. Its gnarled branches stretched high into the sky, and its trunk was scarred with strange symbols. Jacob had walked this trail many times but had never seen this tree before. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the tree exuded its own presence. As Jacob approached, he noticed something at the base of the tree, a pile of stones arranged in a perfect circle. At the center lay a single weathered lantern. Its glass was cracked, and its metal frame was rusted, but it emitted a faint, flickering light. Jacob crouched to examine it, his breath misting in the cold air. When he reached out to touch the lantern, the whispers surged, now deafening. He stumbled back, clutching his ears. The forest seemed to vibrate, the trees swaying despite the still air. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her pale skin luminous in the dim light. She wore a long, tattered dress that seemed to blend with the forest around her. Her eyes were dark and piercing, and her expression was both sorrowful and stern. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cutting through the cacophony of whispers. Jacob staggered to his feet. "Who are you? What is this place?" The woman tilted her head, studying him. "This is the Hollow, a place between worlds. The lantern keeps the balance. You've disturbed it." Jacob glanced at the lantern, now glowing brighter. "I didn't mean to. I was just—" "Your intentions don't matter," she interrupted. "The Hollow doesn't care for intrusions. It demands a keeper." Before Jacob could respond, the ground beneath him trembled. The whispers turned into a low, guttural growl. The woman stepped back, fading into the shadows as the clearing darkened. The lantern's glow intensified, casting long, warped shadows across the trees. Jacob ran. He sprinted down the trail, the forest seeming to twist and shift around him. The path he had walked only hours ago was now unrecognizable, branching into impossible directions. The growling followed him, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he stumbled through the undergrowth. His flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in near total darkness. The only light came from the lantern, which now floated behind him, its glow relentless and accusing. Finally, Jacob burst into another clearing. This one was smaller, surrounded by a perfect circle of trees. At its center stood a stone pedestal, engraved with the same symbols he'd seen on the ancient oak. The lantern hovered above the pedestal, its light steady and unwavering. The whispers returned, but now they formed words. "Choose," they said. "Stay or leave." Jacob's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. "I don't understand," he shouted. "What do you want from me?" The woman's voice echoed around him. "The Hollow must have a keeper. The lantern binds it, keeps it from spilling into your world. If you leave, another will take your place." Images flashed through Jacob's mind. Hikers wandering into the forest, their faces twisted in fear as the Hollow consumed them. He thought of the preserve he'd sworn to protect, the families who came seeking peace and beauty. Could he abandon them to this? The lantern's light dimmed, as if waiting for his decision. Jacob stepped forward. His hands trembled as he reached for the lantern. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a surge of energy shot through him. The whispers crescendo into a deafening roar, then fell silent. The clearing grew still, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. The woman appeared once more, her expression softer now. "You've chosen wisely," she said. "The Hollow will remain contained. For now." Jacob looked at her, his vision blurred by exhaustion. "What happens to me?" "You are the keeper," she said simply. "The Hollow is yours to guard. It will test you, shape you, but you will endure." Before he could respond, the woman dissolved into mist. The lantern's light dimmed, its glow now faint but steady. Jacob felt a strange calm settle over him. The forest no longer seemed hostile, though he knew its dangers had not vanished. In the weeks that followed, Jacob resumed his duties, though he was no longer the same. The lantern now hung in the ranger station, its light a constant reminder of his burden. He could feel the hollow's presence at the edges of his consciousness, whispering its secrets and demands. Visitors continued to come to Hollywood, drawn by its beauty. They never knew the truth of what lay hidden among the trees. But Jacob did, and he would ensure that no one else stumbled into the hollow, no matter the cost. For as long as the lantern burned, he was its keeper. For as long as he could remember, Jonah Hensley had sought answers to the unknown. A historian turned park ranger, he believed that the wilderness held more secrets than any ancient manuscript. When he accepted a position at Ashmolean National Park, nestled deep in the Appalachian Range, he hoped to uncover forgotten stories. But Jonah was unprepared for the story Ashmolean would force him into. The park was sprawling and dense, with trails that wove through thick canopies and ancient groves. Local lore spoke of the Forgotten Path, a trail that was said to appear only under certain conditions. Jonah dismissed the tales as folklore, another way for locals to add mystique to the area. That changed on a late spring afternoon. Jonah was out mapping lesser-used trails when the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The birdsong ceased, and the wind stilled. He checked his compass, but the needle spun erratically. Then he saw it, an opening in the trees that hadn't been there before. A narrow path stretched ahead, framed by moss-covered stones. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Curiosity gnawed at Jonah. He marked his location on his map and ventured forward. The path was unlike any he'd seen before, winding tightly between gnarled trees whose roots rose like skeletal hands. As he walked, the sunlight dimmed, replaced by an eerie green glow filtering through the canopy. His boots crunched over leaves, though he couldn't recall seeing any fall. After what felt like hours, Jonah emerged into a clearing. At its center stood a structure, a stone archway, weathered and cracked, yet radiating an undeniable power. Symbols were etched into the stones, similar to runes he'd seen in ancient texts, but unfamiliar and alien. The air around the arch hummed faintly, sending vibrations through the ground. Jonah hesitated, his instincts warning him to leave, but the historian in him prevailed. He approached the archway and reached out to touch the stone. The moment his fingers grazed the surface, the hum became a roar. The clearing spun, and the air grew cold. When the dizziness subsided, Jonah found himself standing in the same clearing, or so it seemed. But something was off. The trees were taller, their bark darker, and the symbols on the arch glowed faintly. The air was thick, carrying a faint whisper, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. Jonah's radio crackled to life, though he hadn't touched it. A voice, garbled and static-filled, spoke a single word: turn. He spun around, heart pounding. The clearing was empty, but the whispering grew louder. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and the air seemed to press against him. Jonah backed away from the arch, only to realize the path he'd taken was gone. In its place was an impenetrable wall of trees. Panic set in as Jonah tried to find his way out. Every direction led him back to the clearing. The arch loomed, its runes glowing brighter with each passing moment. The whispers coalesced into words, fragmented but clear. Why are you here? Who seeks the past? Jonah shouted into the empty forest. What do you want from me? The response was immediate. The ground trembled, and a figure emerged from the archway. It was humanoid, but its form was shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct. Its voice was layered, as though multiple beings spoke in unison. You have found what should remain hidden, it said. The forgotten path does not reveal itself lightly. Jonah's voice wavered. I didn't mean to intrude. I was curious. The shadow's form shifted, its outline flickering like a dying flame. Curiosity is the first step to ruin. Yet you are here. The path chose you. The figure raised a hand, and the clearing transformed. Jonah stood in the midst of a battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. He saw figures, soldiers in tattered uniforms, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They trudged toward the arch, drawn like moths to a flame. One by one, they vanished through it, their forms dissolving into light. The scene shifted again. Jonah now stood in a village, its streets eerily quiet. The villagers gathered around the arch, their faces filled with reverence and fear. A woman stepped forward, her arms outstretched, and disappeared through the arch. The villagers whispered prayers, their voices trembling. Jonah gasped as he was pulled back into the clearing. The shadow loomed over him, its presence suffocating. What is this place? Jonah demanded. What does the arch do? It is a doorway, the shadow replied. To knowledge, to power, to despair. It has taken much, and given little. Those who walk the forgotten path do so at great cost. Jonah's mind raced. The tales, the disappearances, they all led back to this place. Why did it choose me? The shadow's voice softened. Because you seek answers, but answers are a burden few can bear. The figure raised its hand again and the clearing shimmered. Jonah saw his reflection in the archway, older, worn, his eyes haunted. He saw himself wandering the forest, unable to leave, the path his prison. Leave now, the shadow warned, or the path will claim you. Jonah's heart pounded. He turned and ran, the shadows clawing at his heels. The forest shifted around him, trees closing in and then pulling back. Finally, he stumbled onto a familiar trail, the oppressive weight lifting as sunlight broke through the canopy. Back at the ranger station, Jonah couldn't shake the experience. His compass lay broken, and the map he'd marked was blank. The clearing, the archway, it was as if they'd never existed. Jonah tried to forget, to resume his duties, but the forest wouldn't let him. Every so often he'd see the path, a fleeting glimpse between the trees. The whispers returned, faint and teasing, always drawing him toward the unknown. Months later, Jonah made his decision. He packed his belongings, leaving behind a note for the next ranger. If you find the forgotten path, turn away. It reveals what should remain hidden. It calls for answers, but those answers will break you. As Jonah disappeared into the forest, the path opened before him, welcoming him back into its depths. The shadows embraced him, and the whispers grew louder. The forgotten path had claimed another.